The lunch invite came through on a Tuesday morning. Subject line, catch up? Just that. No context, no attachments. Preston liked vague emails, made him feel mysterious. But after 11 years under the man, I knew better. Nobody calls you to Maxwell's just to catch up. Maxwell's had white tablecloths and imported wine lists. It wasn't where people like me got told we were valued. It's where we got replaced. Still, I accepted, smiled when I walked in, shook his hand like nothing was off. He was already seated, tie loosened just enough to signal casual power. The maitre d' gave me that soft look, half pity, half confusion, like he couldn't decide if I was the client or the cleanup crew. Preston ordered before I even sat down. Steak, medium rare. For me, the sea base. Always liked choosing for people. Said it showed decisiveness. What it really showed was that he didn't think my opinion mattered anymore. He opened with small talk, asked about my weekend, the Bucks game, whether I'd tried that new sushi place near the river. I played along, nodded, laughed once or twice. Let him believe I didn't see it coming. Then he said the words, smoothed out like a napkin. Derek, we're going in a new direction. There it was. He reached for his water glass. You've been invaluable here, truly. You've built something incredible. But Harrison's nephew, Nathan, just finished his master's at MIT. Brilliant kid. Digital transformation, big picture stuff. We think he's the future. I smiled and nodded. Sounds exciting. Preston blinked like he hadn't expected it to go this smoothly. I know this might be hard to hear. These things happen, I said. He exhaled in relief. You'll have 6 weeks to transition things. Over. We'll announce the leadership change after the next quarterly all-hands. I'll have Diane send you a formal timeline. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out the NDA. Already printed. Already tabbed where he wanted me to sign. I didn't even glance at the legalese. I'd probably written more binding code in my career than anything in that document. He looked almost disappointed I didn't put up a fight. Maybe he wanted a scene so he could call security, feel justified. Instead, I asked him how his wife was doing. He looked stunned. Back at the office, I returned to my desk and noticed right away. My admin access was gone. No more override permissions, no server room privileges, no access to production diagnostics. Just like that, I was another mid-level employee without a title. Then the kicker. My name had been removed from the leadership email list. I checked the internal directory. Director of IT vacant. I sat back in my chair and took a deep breath. No anger, not yet. Just a strange hollow space opening up in my chest. They'd made the decision weeks ago, maybe longer. The lunch wasn't the beginning, it was the final brushstroke. I looked around the floor. My team was still buzzing. Vanessa was reviewing uptime logs. Luis was hunched over a terminal with headphones on, probably running a network stress test. They had no idea yet, and that was the part that hurt more than I expected. Not the betrayal. Not even the demotion, but the silence. 11 years, hundreds of weekends, dozens of overnight server rebuilds, late-night crisis calls I answered half asleep. My systems had kept 3 production facilities online during regional power outages. I'd gotten Christmas cards from clients. I'd built the backbone of Riverton's tech, and now I was being deleted like a comment someone didn't like. I pulled up the security dashboard one last time. Noticed the new admin login Nathan had been issued. Created 3 weeks ago. Full. Access granted. That meant while Preston was asking me about the Bucks game, Nathan had already been poking through my configurations. I stared at the screen for a long time. Then I opened a blank notepad file and typed 4 words. Let's begin. Then, I didn't come to Milwaukee for a career. I came because Ellie got into graduate school here. That was 16 years ago, back when we still talked about travel plans and baby names. I figured I'd pick up contract work while she chased her dream. She had the plan. I had the flexibility. My flexibility ended with divorce papers on the kitchen counter. No fights, no shouting, no final straw I could point to, just, we want different things. 7 years of building a life, and suddenly I was splitting. furniture, and Googling how long you could sleep on a couch before your spine gave out. It was Luis who told me about the opening at Riverton. I didn't know him then. We were 2 layers removed on a message board for IT freelancers. Small manufacturing firm, recent ransomware hit, looking for someone to patch things fast, he wrote. Temporary gig, no benefits, total mess. It sounded perfect. When I walked into that server room for the first time, I honestly thought it was a prank. Passwords on sticky notes. No backups. A dusty old tower labeled Prod 1 was propped up by a book. I wish I were exaggerating. They were running half their operations through outdated spreadsheets. I asked the floor supervisor what their recovery plan was if the network went down. He shrugged and pointed to a filing cabinet. I was supposed to be there 6 weeks, but then the thing happened that always happens when I'm surrounded by broken systems. I saw what it could be. They didn't need miracles. They needed someone who could speak both machine and human. Someone who could see 10 steps ahead of failure. I stayed up 3 nights in a row reworking their basic permission structure. Once I stabilized that, I wrote a script to monitor server health in real time. Then I overhauled their backup routines. Then the routers. Then the floor system integrations. By week 4, Preston offered me a full-time role. Director of IT, he said, like it was a magic phrase. I said yes, I needed a paycheck. But somewhere between the broken machines and 2 a.m. maintenance windows, I started caring. They gave me a blank slate, and I built the bones of the company on it. Every time someone asked why their order processed faster, or how our systems stayed online during the Midwest blackout, the answer was me. Not my name, not my face, just the infrastructure I held together, quietly, reliably. In year 3, I pitched Preston a 5-year overhaul plan. We do this right, I told him, and we'll never lose a client to downtime again. He gave me the budget. That's when I hired Vanessa. She was sharp, detail-focused, emotionally intelligent. Clients liked her. I brought in Luis full-time. Next. Best script engineer I've worked with. Over the next 2 years, we went from 5 part-time troubleshooters to a 30-person operation supporting 3 facilities, 24/7. I built custom monitoring tools, designed a private client portal that let them track production in real time, created rollback safety nets in case anything failed mid-cycle. We weren't just keeping the lights on anymore. We were the reason the lights never went out. I remember the first time Preston brought me to a board meeting. He introduced me as the guy who makes sure none of you ever hear about the problems before they're solved. They laughed. I didn't. Then there was the Christmas party in 2019. Harrison Wells, the majority owner, pulled me aside with a glass of scotch. You modernized us, he said. We couldn't have expanded without your systems. I didn't know what to say. I think I just nodded and said, glad it's working. I wasn't flashy, never wanted to be. I wore the same fleece to work for 8 winters. Used a flip phone until 2017. Didn't care about job titles or LinkedIn profiles. I just wanted to build things that worked and know they'd keep working long after I walked away. But loyalty has a funny way of blinding you to motion at the edges. Looking back, I can see the signs. The shrinking invites, the missing attachments. The way Preston started canceling our weekly briefings but still claimed he was in the loop. I told myself it was seasonal. Stress, a realignment of priorities. Truth is, I didn't want to believe the people I'd carried would leave me behind the second a resume with shinier degrees walked through the door. I guess my ex-wife was right. About one thing. I was loyal to a fault. It didn't happen all at once, it never does. First came the audit. Some consultant I'd never heard of showed up on site, armed with a clipboard and vague credentials. Claimed he was reviewing our digital infrastructure for efficiency opportunities. His questions were generic, almost insultingly so. What's your redundancy model? Do you maintain off-site backups? Is your server cluster virtualized? I built the damn cluster from scratch. If he'd read the internal wiki, or hell, asked anyone on my team, he'd know I answered those Questions 3 years ago in 3 different proposals. When I asked who authorized the audit, he said executive team, then pretended to check his notes. 2 days later, I lost access to the board folder on the shared drive. No warning. Just a polite error message. Permission denied. I flagged it to IT compliance. They said it must be a system sync issue and promised to look into it. They never did. And I didn't push. At the time, I still believed there had to be a good reason. That was the beginning of the drift. The soft, polite kind of exclusion. Meetings moved to time slots that clashed with my team briefings. Leadership updates were shared verbally, or as needed. I went from running strategy to reacting to it. Then came the retreat in January. Annual leadership thing. Casual clothes, PowerPoint decks, fake enthusiasm. Preston gave a speech about fresh ideas and next-gen thinking. I remember Harrison cornering someone over cocktails, bragging about his nephew finishing his master's at MIT. Brilliant kid, he said. Silicon Valley companies already sniffing around. I didn't think much of it. Everyone has a brilliant nephew. I smiled and nodded, nursed my ginger ale, and made a mental note to update the server logs when I got back. That's when things really started slipping. Preston canceled 3 of our 4 weekly check-ins that month. Each excuse more corporate than the last. Rescheduling due to bandwidth. Looping in product first. We'll circle back post-QBR. Then Vanessa came into my office, nervous. Said she'd been pulled into a strategy session she wasn't originally invited to. But halfway through, someone mentioned system stability, and she brought up a recent deployment tweak I'd led. Preston changed the subject. Fast. Something felt off, she said. Like they were talking around you. I remember sitting in my chair, watching the slow pulse of the monitor light on my desk. I wanted to tell her she was imagining it, that we'd been through rough patches before, that people just forget to loop others in sometimes, but I couldn't say it. Because I'd already seen the logs. 3 months earlier, during a routine review, I'd caught something strange. Small, unauthorized access attempts buried in the request queues. Not from external actors. Internal IPs. High-level credentials. Someone on the executive floor was trying to peek into our admin documentation. I'd flagged the activity. Quietly rerouted the logs to a private drive. When the attempts became more frequent, I narrowed it down. They were checking our monitoring logic, our fallback triggers, the notes I kept on undocumented procedures. Workarounds only my senior engineers knew existed. They weren't just preparing to replace me. They were copying me first, trying to absorb everything I'd ever built, then wipe my name off the blueprint. Then came the moment I'll never forget. Server room, late evening. Most people had gone home. I liked being there after hours, just me and the quiet hum of machinery. I'd chosen every component in that room, installed the racks, designed the airflow layout, built the redundancy logic into every blinking light and cooling vent. That room ran 3 production lines in 3 cities. I was running a last-minute check on our holiday load balancing script when I heard the door open. Working late? Came a voice. I turned. Nathan. He looked like a promo ad for a startup, clean haircut, expensive watch, leather laptop bag. 30 maybe. Just enough stubble to suggest confidence, not laziness. Just routine checks, I said. You need something? Walked in like he owned the place, getting the lay of the land. Preston said you'd be showing me around soon. I gave him a long look. Did he? He paused in front of the server cluster. Impressive setup. A bit old school, but solid. Old school. That was the term. I'd upgraded that hardware less than a year ago, choosing stability over trendiness because our clients needed 99.99% uptime, not hashtags. Your documentation's thorough, he added. I've been reading through your protocols. I have some ideas for modernization. He said it like he was doing me a favor, like he wasn't already wearing my future as a badge. Looking forward to hearing them, I said. The words tasted like chalk. After he left, I sat down and opened the access logs again. Sure enough, his credentials had been issued 3 weeks ago, top-level clearance. He'd already combed through my private documentation library. I stared at the screen for a long minute. Then I pulled out my phone. Text. To Luis, coffee tomorrow? Joe's. 6:30. I hit send. And just like that, the countdown began. Luis was already at Joe's when I arrived. He was never late, but he looked like he hadn't slept much. Hoodie, dark circles, 2 empty espresso cups already stacked beside him. I figured, he said before I even sat down. They're phasing me out, I replied. Quietly, he just nodded. For a few seconds, we said nothing. Outside, commuters drifted past the window, bundled in layers and early morning silence. Inside, the coffee shop hummed with half-heard orders and the hiss of the steamer. You've seen the access logs? I asked. Yeah, he said. They had me explain the diagnostic system last week. Asked if it was too niche to be sustainable. I scoffed. I built that because the default system let 3 production warnings go unnoticed in 2018. Luis looked down at his coffee. I'm sorry, man. I should have told you. I shook my head. You've got kids, a mortgage. I get it. He looked up. So what's your plan? That's when it hit me. I already had one. It wasn't revenge, not exactly. It was protection. They think everything's in the documentation, I said. But it's not even close. Luis tilted his head. The undocumented stuff? I nodded. The patches I wrote after hours. The adaptive load balancing. Scripts. The diagnostic heuristics. The monitoring dashboard that alerts you 10 seconds before the factory system even realizes it's in trouble. System sync, he said quietly. Pieces of it, I said. Technically, the original version predates my Riverton contract. Developed it during that freelance gig in '09, and the company never bought it. They licensed it. Luis sat back. So if they kill your access, they lose the real-time sync, the predictive alerts, the fallback coordination across sites. You gonna pull it? No, I said firmly. I'm not sabotaging anything. I'm not that guy. He nodded slowly. But, I continued, I'm not handing over what's mine either. Not unless they come to the table. We spent the next hour sketching it out. What I needed, what I still had access to, what gaps I'd need to close. Luis would help from the inside, but only on personal time, off network. I wasn't going to put him at risk. That afternoon, I went back through every folder I'd ever archived. Found backups of my original code, deployment notes, old emails from Preston acknowledging System Sync's licensing structure. I backed them up to a private drive. Then I printed them. 2 copies, one for me, one for a safe deposit box. Next, I called Vanessa. She picked up on the second ring. Hey, Derek, everything okay? I need a few hours of your time after work, I said. Private setting, no logins, just conversation. There was a beat. Then, tell me where. We met in a quiet corner booth at an old pizza joint off Lincoln Avenue. I explained everything, the early signs, Nathan, the transition, the fact that they were trying to package everything I'd built into a clean handoff for a sale. She didn't say much, just listened. Her fingers steepled under her chin, her eyes sharp. You're not asking me to do anything illegal, she said at the end. No, just need someone I trust to validate the timeline. If they twist the story later, I want people to know what really happened. She nodded. I've got your back. On my way home, I stopped by the bank and opened a new safe deposit box. Inside, I placed a hard copy of the original System Sync licensing terms, the one I'd signed with Riverton during my first year. It was clear as day, usage granted, ownership retained. It was the kind of thing HR didn't pay attention to until they needed it, until someone like Nathan came knocking and asked why they didn't just own the tech. I slept better that night than I had in weeks, not because I felt victorious, because for the first time in months I felt like I was back in control. The next few days I played the part perfectly. I attended every meeting, took notes, smiled during Nathan's long-winded talks about modernizing legacy architecture. Even offered a few polite nods during his attempts to explain my own systems back to me. Every night I backed up another folder, Every lunch, I filled out another legal form. By the end of the week, I'd already submitted my provisional patent applications for 2 critical components of System Sync. Not the entire framework, just enough of the core logic that anything they built using it would need to either license from me or start from scratch. I wasn't locking the doors. I was installing a peephole. I was 3 steps ahead, and they didn't even realize I'd started moving. By Friday, I knew who was with me and who was staying silent. A few people stopped meeting my eyes in the hallway. Others, like Vanessa and Luis, kept nodding quietly, subtly, as if to say, "We're still here." I printed one more document, folded it into an envelope. The next time I saw Vanessa, I slid it across her desk. "If anything happens this week, anything unusual, open this," I said. "It explains everything." She didn't ask questions. She just placed it in her drawer, locked it, and went back to reviewing uptime reports like nothing had changed. But everything had. I called Darren Phillips that Saturday. We'd worked together on a freelance job years ago, back when I still thought building systems for other people would be enough. Darren was a network security specialist who liked digging where people didn't want him to, paranoid by nature, reliable by trade. I gave him the condensed version, the new golden boy, the leadership shuffle, the quiet replacement. Then I added, the part that didn't make sense. "They're not just cutting me out," I said. "They're studying me, lifting every line of code like it's a blueprint. But the company's stable, profitable, so why the rush?" "Send me what you've got," he said. I dumped everything into a secured folder. Access logs, documentation download patterns, time-stamped credential changes. Darren didn't ask why I had so much of it. He knew. 2 nights later, he called me at 11:17 p.m. "You're not going to like this," he said. "Try me." He'd found a trail of SEC filings, subtle, quiet, buried under innocuous corporate language, but unmistakable. "Riverton's being acquired," he said. "Tech Core Industries out of Boston, manufacturing conglomerate, deep pockets. Strong M&A activity the past 2 years. And they're close, like very close." I was silent. Darren continued. "The filings mention a premium valuation based on modernized tech infrastructure and seamless leadership continuity." "System Sync," I said flatly. "Yup," he replied. "The documentation you built, the monitoring stack, the cross-site failover protocol. They're calling it Proprietary Innovation Positioning Riverton at the Frontier of Digitally Integrated Manufacturing." I leaned back in my chair. The language wasn't accidental. That was the pitch, the crown jewel in their sale, and they were planning to make it look like it had nothing to do with me. Darren wasn't finished. "There's more. Harrison, majority owner, cashed out. Most of his shares last quarter. Quiet sale to a private holding group. It's in the fine print. He's getting out." I muttered. "And Preston?" I asked, still holding his stake. "But the acquisition terms include executive retention, bonuses, board seats, and transition packages. They walk away rich. You walk away scrubbed." It hit harder than I expected. I'd already accepted the betrayal. But this was different. This was theft disguised as strategy. Erasure repackaged as leadership vision. "They're selling my work," I said, more to myself than to Darren. "And they're betting you won't make noise," he replied, "because you're quiet, reliable, the backbone." I didn't respond. He paused. "Look, legally it's gray. You worked there. But if you have pre-employment code, licensing docs, anything that proves origination, I do. Then you've got leverage. Not a nuke, but a very sharp knife." The line went quiet for a moment. "What are you gonna do?" he asked. I didn't answer. Not yet. The next morning, I went into my old external drives again. I found it. A folder. Labeled Sync Core Initial. Inside, the first working prototype of System Sync dated 8 months before my Riverton hire. Test scripts, personal dev notes, even screenshots of my freelance GUI builder. Then the real kicker, an email from Preston dated 9.5 years ago. "Hey Derek, can you integrate that dashboard thing you showed me last week into the Riverton?" Logs. Love how it works. Once things settle, let's figure out the ownership piece. We'll formalize it. I'd forgotten about that message, but reading it again made my stomach flip. He'd known. Even back then. I printed the email. Put it in. The second folder with the licensing agreement and the code-base summary. Dated everything. Signed it with a time-stamped notary app. Now it wasn't just my word. It was proof. That Monday, the leadership team announced a new phase of organizational evolution. Internal email. Corporate fluff. A paragraph near the bottom introduced Nathan Blake as the incoming director of IT, praising his vision for scalable modernization. My name wasn't mentioned. I spent the day watching my team react. Some stared at their screens, stunned. Others looked over at me, unsure of how to process it. Vanessa mouthed, "What's happening?" I gave her the smallest of nods. Later that afternoon, I requested a sit-down with Preston, and HR Diane from legal joined us. Polished, unreadable, with a folder in front of her like she was auditioning for a courtroom drama. I kept my voice level. "I want to address System Sync," I said. "The proprietary monitoring and integration framework. Parts of that system predate my employment. Others were developed under a licensing model. I've retained ownership of key components, and the company has used them under that assumption. For a decade." Diane slid a document across the table. "The employment agreement states that anything developed during tenure becomes company property." I nodded. "That clause doesn't override prior intellectual property or independently developed frameworks. It also doesn't address the licensing terms signed in year one." Preston looked visibly uncomfortable. "That was 10 years ago," he said. "The company's evolved. So has System Sync," I said, "which makes it even more important to clarify ownership before your next phase of evolution." Diane leaned forward. "Are you making a legal claim?" "No, I'm offering a conversation," I said. "A path forward." Preston cleared his throat. "We'll look into it." I stood. "You do that." As I walked out, I knew they wouldn't. They'd stall. Hope I got tired. Hope I disappeared like they planned. But I wasn't disappearing. I was documenting, and I was just getting started. They wanted a clean handoff. I gave them a countdown. After the meeting with Preston and Diane, I knew they weren't going to acknowledge anything. No one was going to dig through a decade of legal agreements and emails to validate my ownership. They were stalling, buying. Time until I was out of the building, out of the system, and out of their story. So I moved fast. That night, I drove to Luis's place and handed him a flash drive. No cloud uploads, no messages, just cold plastic. "Everything you asked for," he said. "Original code bases, deployment logs, authentication keys. I made backups too." I nodded. "Why are you helping me?" He didn't flinch. "Because they think we're all replaceable." That weekend I worked non-stop. First I filed a second round of provisional patents, this time focusing on the deployment mechanisms and real-time fault detection logic. The stuff that kept Riverton's machines running when everyone else's failed. The stuff Nathan didn't even realize wasn't standard. Then I rewrote 3 critical components of System Sync: quiet, clean, and legal. At the core, I inserted a license verification protocol, code that would check for a valid digital signature on startup. No signature? System degrades gracefully over 48 hours and then halts. No damage, no data loss. Just a polite message: license expired. Please contact the developer to renew. I also updated the system log behavior to flag any tampering attempts and route them to a private server Darren helped me configure off-site. Next, I hard-coded the expiration. 8 days from my final day at Riverton. Not a virus, not sabotage, just license management. On Monday, I arrived early. Vanessa was already at her desk. "You heard about the accelerated timeline?" she asked. I nodded. 2 weeks now. Nathan's ready. How's the team taking it? Still in shock, she said. He's been calling emergency meetings, tried to reverse engineer your monitoring dashboard over the weekend. Didn't go well. Anyone? Hurt? No, but they missed 3 alerts. Line 3 was down for 4 hours. Lost 40 grand in production. I kept my face neutral. Sorry to hear that. Derek, she said, hesitating. I think I'm next. I looked up. He's been asking if my role's essential, if I know how your back-end logic works. I think he's cleaning house. I nodded. I'd suspected as much. Vanessa knew the architecture too well. She understood why things were built, not just how. Do you trust me? I asked. She didn't hesitate. Completely. I slid a sealed envelope across the desk. If anything happens this week, if they change direction, freeze access, or try to pin something on me, open this. Share it with legal if you have to. She tucked it into her drawer without a word. That afternoon, Nathan called a team meeting, his first as official director. I wasn't invited, but I showed up anyway. He blinked when he saw me, then forced a smile. Derek, glad you could join. We were just reviewing some proposed changes to the network architecture. I leaned against the doorframe. Which architecture specifically? He straightened. Main production floor systems. We're going to streamline the protocols. Those protocols are why our machines don't fail during load spikes, I said. They're customized for our hardware, not plug and play. Nathan's smile thinned. Modern systems don't require such complex workarounds, Vanessa cut in. They're not workarounds. They're adaptations. Derek designed them after the 2018 controller meltdown. The room fell silent. Nathan shifted, then gestured to the whiteboard. I appreciate the historical perspective, but we're moving forward. Dismissed. That night I uploaded everything, my code, my documentation, my legal records, to a secure private server. Then I activated the digital license protocol. System sync would continue running until it didn't. On Tuesday, I played the role. Polite, efficient. Finished every documentation request Nathan gave me. Sat through his planning meetings. Gave feedback like a consultant on a clock. But I also sent a message to TechCore. They'd reached out once already, after hearing I was transitioning out. Wanted to discuss mutual business interests. I'd ignored it then. Now, I replied. Wednesday morning, I got a meeting invite from their VP of Operations. Happy to connect post-departure, he wrote. We'd love to hear your perspective. Riverton's tech stack. I forwarded the email to my lawyer. Then I made the call. By midnight, everything was in place. The system logs were clean. The code was tight. The license verification sequence was finalized. I opened a terminal window and typed, Verification sequence Alpha 7. Complete. I hit enter. The countdown had begun. On Thursday, Nathan pulled me into his office. Some of the team says you've bitten him off, he said. Anything we should be concerned about? Just focused on the transition, I replied. He studied me. We're changing all system passwords tomorrow. Standard post-departure protocol. Of course, I said. Won't affect core functionality. He blinked. What do you mean? Just that system sync is built to operate regardless of admin changes. That's the beauty of it. He didn't know whether I was threatening him or reassuring him. He dismissed me 5 minutes later. Friday morning, I turned in my badge. Signed the exit paperwork. Declined the farewell lunch Nathan scheduled. I don't think Preston even looked up when I walked past his office. By noon, I was gone. By midnight, so was their control. Monday started like any other, except by 9:17 a.m. Everything stopped. First, the production floor in Milwaukee froze. Operators stood staring at idle machines, screens flashing an error in bold gray text. License expired. Please contact the developer to renew. Then the same thing hit St. Louis, then Dayton. By 9:45, all 3 facilities were offline. Dispatches came through the help desk like a dam breaking. No one could override the alert. No one had access to the backend. Even Nathan's shiny new credentials were rejected. Vanessa didn't call me. She didn't need to. By 10:30, Preston did. My phone buzzed. Unknown number. I let it go to voicemail, then he tried again. I answered the 3rd time. Derek, he said, urgent but trying to stay composed. We're having a situation. I heard, I said calmly. He tried to lead with authority. The systems aren't responding. Production is halted, your software. System sync, I corrected him. And the license expired. There was a pause. I could hear chatter behind him, raised voices, panic barely kept at bay. What did you do? He asked, voice tight. I followed protocol, I said. The original integration agreement outlined a licensing arrangement. Clause 7, if you remember, covers expiration and renewal options. That agreement is over a decade old, and still legally binding, I said. Unless your legal team found something I didn't. Silence. I've sent a renewal agreement to your legal department, I continued. Terms are simple. Recognition of ownership, fair compensation for continued use, and an NDA covering the circumstances of my departure. This is extortion, he hissed. This is business, I replied. You're the one who taught me that. Another long pause. What's the price? He asked finally. Let your lawyers review the document, I said. It's all there. But I'd move quickly. Every hour the lines are down costs you money, and I'm sure TechCore is watching. I hung up. Then I silenced my phone. For the first time in months, I leaned back in my chair and just breathed. By 3 p.m., their legal team had reviewed the agreement. By 5 p.m., it was signed. I got everything in writing. Recognition of my original ownership of System Sync, a renewable license fee structure, and a binding NDA that barred anyone from suggesting I'd been anything less than professional during my exit. No apologies. No thank yous, just money, legitimacy, control. 3 days later, I sat in TechCore's regional office across from their VP of Operations. Sleek space, minimalist design. The kind of place where people pretend disruption comes from whiteboards and beanbags. He slid a contract across the table. We're still acquiring Riverton, he said, but we want you to lead the technical integration. As a consultant, not an employee. The contract offered double what Riverton paid me. Full control of my hours. Work from anywhere. Ownership of all my intellectual property permanently. What about Nathan? I asked. The VP's expression tightened slightly. He'll be pursuing other opportunities. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I just signed. 2 weeks later, Luis called. They let Nathan go this morning, he said. Quiet, no statement, no email. The official story? He left to explore personal ventures. I nodded. And Preston? I asked. Luis paused. Still CEO for now, but TechCore's keeping him on the sidelines. They gave him a new title but no decision-making authority. Window office and no phone line, I said. Exactly. I should have felt vindicated. But what I felt instead was stillness. Like something heavy had been lifted off my shoulders, and I was finally free to decide what mattered. The following week, I went back to the lake, the one Ellie and I used to sit by in the early years, before grad school deadlines and slow silences ate everything. The sun was setting behind the trees, the water dark and calm. I opened my laptop, connected to the private server, and for the first time, System Sync ran under my name, from my system, under my control. I wasn't anyone's safety net anymore. Was the platform. The first consulting check hit my account the following month. It wasn't just the size that stunned me. It was the clarity. Clean money, earned on my terms. No politics, no middle managers, no pretending to care about someone else's nephew with a fancy degree, and no scars. I used part of it for a down payment on a cabin near the lake. Nothing extravagant, just a clean, quiet place with a wraparound deck, fiber internet, and a view of the water where the light stayed soft well into the evening. I furnished it myself, built the desk with my own hands. It felt good to build something literal again. 3 weeks. After the move, Vanessa called. She didn't waste time. Still got room on your consulting team? She asked. I've got more work than I can handle, I said. And I'd rather do it with people who actually know what they're doing. She started the next Monday. Luis followed not long after, then Rena from Floor Ops, then Martin from Dev Support. One by one, the right people found their way back. Not as subordinates, but as partners. We didn't recreate Riverton's IT department. We made something better, streamlined, independent, sane. We took contracts from 3 manufacturing companies in our first 6 months. Each one came to us for the same reason. They wanted stability from someone who knew what could go wrong and had already lived through it. I didn't chase growth. I didn't try to scale. I didn't talk about disruption or synergy or transformation. I talked about uptime. System sync became a full platform. Licensing agreements rolled in steadily. I added a support layer, a private client portal, and modular integrations for industries beyond manufacturing. It felt like watching something I raised finally walk on its own. Preston never contacted me again, but I ran into him about a year after everything went down. It was at some trendy restaurant downtown, one of those places with handwritten menus and minimalist light fixtures. I was having lunch with a supplier. He was sitting near the bar, alone, reading his phone like it owed him something. I saw him notice me. He looked away at first. Then, maybe, out of pride or guilt or habit, he stood up and walked over. "You won," he said simply. I didn't answer right away. I looked at him. Really looked. His suit wasn't as crisp. His eyes had a tightness around them. The confidence was still there, but the edges were worn now. He looked like a man who had made peace with being irrelevant, but not quite enough to accept it. I finally said, "It wasn't about winning." He raised an eyebrow. "It was about knowing what I'm worth." He nodded once, no apology, no speech, just that. Then he walked away. I sat back down. My supplier had gone quiet during the exchange. "Former boss?" he asked. Something like that. That night, I sat on the deck at the cabin, watching the stars ripple across the lake's surface. I thought about all the systems I'd built, not just code, not just infrastructure. The invisible scaffolding, trust, loyalty, process. The people who carried pieces of my legacy in their own habits. The funny thing is, when you're in it, you don't see it. You're too busy fixing the next thing, filling the next hole, keeping the machine moving. You don't realize you're the one holding it all together until someone tries to do it without you and fails. I didn't feel triumph. Not really. I felt balance, peace. They could keep their titles and exit packages. I had something better. Freedom, clarity. A team that believed in building things the right way, even when it took longer, even when no one noticed. And the knowledge that in the end, value has a way of finding daylight, even if it has to claw its way through 15 years of shadow first. Mornings at the cabin are slow. Coffee on the porch by 7 rise, usually black. Some days I read. Other days I just sit and listen to the wind move through the trees. It's not silence exactly, just a different kind of noise, one that doesn't ask anything from you. There's no traffic hum, no meeting pings, no blinking, red alerts, just birds, water, the occasional rustle of a deer somewhere past the clearing. It's the kind of quiet I used to think I'd hate. Turns out, it's exactly what I needed. Every so often, a memory surfaces. The look on Nathan's face when System Sync locked him out. The shift in Preston's voice when he realized the software wasn't his to control. The way Vanessa nodded, small, sure, unshaken, when she realized we'd made it out. But those memories don't sting anymore. They're just points on a map. I've already traveled. Last month, we signed our 10th licensing client. I didn't celebrate, just added the log to the system and kept moving. The wins feel different now. Quieter, deeper. Vanessa handles most of the onboarding. Luis checks the integrations. We still have group calls once a week. Short, no fluff. We laugh more now. I think it's because we're no longer trying to prove anything, just doing good work for people who actually need it. I still write code. Sometimes, not because I have to, but because I want to. I like solving problems no one else has noticed yet. I like building things that hum beneath the surface, steady and invisible, until they're not. I never reached out to Ellie. Never felt the need. Whatever we had, it served its purpose. Got me here. There's something powerful in letting things, without bitterness, and something even more powerful in walking away before someone else decides how your story finishes. Last week, I added a note to the login screen of System Sync's newest release. Just 4 words, built with intention, always. That's what it was about all along, not control, not revenge, intention. Because when you build something with care, when you give it your name, your nights, your best ideas, it deserves better than to be passed off as someone else's shortcut. It deserves your protection. So I gave it mine. One night, just before the snow came in, I sat outside wrapped in an old hoodie, watching the sky fade to steel. Gray. The lake was frozen at the edges, just enough to catch the light. I thought about the moment Preston told me they were going in a new direction, and how in the end, I did too. A better one.